Well, here we are at the end of the first part of Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, the PeekaBoo World, which is, I think I said the last chapter was the crucial one, but maybe this chapter is the really crucial one, in which he describes how the old culture, the print-dominated culture, which he calls the age of exposition, the forces that he claims made it give way to the new culture, the age of show business, the so-called PeekaBoo world. And that expression, the PeekaBoo world, is supposed to be suggestive of a world in which I think the dominant idea is, unlike the world of print-dominated or typographical culture, the PeekaBoo world is a world of decontextualized information. And as we'll see, Postman is certainly not the first person to point this out. There's an interesting precedent that came to mind as I was reading Postman in American philosophy. Well, here it is. I mean, the Telegraph. I mean, my goodness, something that really has been antiquated or obsolete for decades and decades, if not 100 years or more. It's the introduction of the telephone. But it was the telegraph that Postman, introduction of the telegraph in America, that Postman says was the real culprit. It immediately, as he describes it, began to affect newspapers and the way that knowledge was, or information was disseminated. It truly broke down the barriers of time and space, because it was the first technology that allowed for the movement of information faster than physical movement, which is really quite incredible if you think about it as a turning point in human history. But what is the effect of that Postman wants to focus on? He says the telegraph made information into a commodity, a thing that could be bought and sold irrespective of its uses or meaning. As he describes it, as he said earlier in the book, the idea of the news of the day is an invention of the medium itself. The idea that there's today's news, there's what's current, is really not something that's just sort of there. It's something we create through the media that we use. And it really was the telegraph that enabled us to send information very quickly. But the idea is that it commodified it in the sense that it sent out these packets of information that are divorced from any context. You can know, as Thoreau said, if we connect up Europe and America, the first thing we'll hear is that some princess has the cough or something trivial. As Postman says, it introduced irrelevancy. It's okay for something to be irrelevant as long as it's new. And this is in contrast to even the more trivial things that newspapers used to have in them. That even if they were trivial, human interest stories, salacious things, they were things that were of some more enduring value, and moreover, they were local. They weren't news and interest stories from something happening on the other side of the country or the other side of the world. So in reference to that, Postman says, for the most part, the information they provided, so let's say newspapers before the telegraph, was not only local, but largely functional, tied to the problems and decisions readers had to address in order to manage their personal and community affairs. And this is what he's claiming, the telegraph, and of course later, more effective communications technologies. This is what was destroyed, the functionality of information. Now we just get information thrown at us without context, without any relation to our lives. Information that we are bombarded with, but that we can't put to use. That's why he's saying they're not functional. I have to say that rereading it reminded me of something that was said earlier in the 20th century by the great American philosopher John Dewey in his book Freedom and Culture, where he remarked upon pretty much the phenomenon that Postman is describing, and largely Postman is just sort of expressing what seems to be the same idea. It's a kind of a big chunk, but I thought it would be worthwhile to see that Postman is not the first person to sort of point these things out. Dewey says, today the influences that affect the actions performed by individuals are so remote as to be unknown. We are at the mercy of events acting upon us in unexpected, abrupt, and violent ways. In a certain respect, this is a forerunner to the massage. The medium is the massage idea, the idea that we're constantly being, in the modern world, the individual is constantly being bombarded by influences that are sort of come out of nowhere. The bearing of these considerations upon the cultural conditions involved in maintenance of freedom is not far to seek. It is very directly connected with what now seems to us the oversimplification of the democratic idea indulged in by the authors of our Republican government. They had in mind persons whose daily occupations stimulated initiative and vigor, and who possessed information which, even if narrow in scope, bore pretty directly upon what they had to do, while its sources were pretty much within their control. Very interesting idea, very reminiscent of Postman. That is, that the original democratic idea in America was that the people who were ruling themselves in this republic would have access to information which they would use to rule themselves, right? And even if it was narrow in scope, it bore pretty directly upon what they had to do. So he continues, their judgment was exercised upon things within the range of their activities and their contexts. People knew less, but what they knew was more relevant to their lives, I think is the common idea here. The press, the telegraph, the telephone, and radio, so this is Dewey writing in 1939, have broadened indefinitely the range of information at the disposal of the average person. It would be foolish to deny that a certain quickening of sluggish minds has resulted. It is hearkening back to Marx's comment in the Communist Manifesto that capitalism saves the masses from the idiocy of rural life. That is, an idiot in the original Greek sense was not a stupid person. It was a person who only paid attention to his or her own life and had no consciousness of anything wider beyond their little sphere, idiotes, having to do with one's own. Both Marx and Dewey, and certainly McLuhan, and of course Postman, would have to admit that modern media makes us aware of being part of a large world, but this is an ambivalent thing. But quite aside from having opened avenues through which organized propaganda may operate continuously to stir emotion and to leave behind a deposit of opinion, Fox News, sorry to say, there is much information about which judgment is not called upon to respond, and where even if it wanted to, it cannot act effectively, so dispersive is the material about which it is called upon to exert itself. This is reminiscent of Postman's discussion of, all the things that we're told about every day in the news, even serious subjects, but what can we do about them? Very little. What am I going to do about Trump being president? What am I going to do about the Israeli-Palestinian situation? What am I going to do about North Korea? What am I going to do about families being broken up at the U.S. border? I mean, may have strong opinions about these things, but this is what Postman calls the impotence that follows irrelevance. Is that I can't use this in my life very effectively. This is Dewey still. The average person is surrounded today by ready-made intellectual goods, as he is by ready-made foods, articles, and all kinds of gadgets. He has not the personal share in making either intellectual or material goods that his pioneer ancestors had. Consequently, they knew better what they themselves were about, though they knew infinitely less concerning what the world at large was doing. This is an interesting observation and probably very much influential, this line of thinking on Postman, is that McLuhan tells us that we live in a global village. And, that's probably true in some way, but we're closer to each other in a way, but the knowledge we have of each other is superficial, because the knowledge that we get through electronic media tends to be superficial, decontextualized images. He talks about the influence of photography becoming more and more dominant over print, as well as what the Telegraph is doing with language, so that we have plenty of information about the world, but it all seems to be superficial. And we may be connected up with people, but not in the kind of authentic, deep way that you are with people within your actual, in real life IRL community. Coleridge, this is back to Postman. Coleridge's famous line about water everywhere without a drop to drink may serve as a metaphor of a decontextualized information environment. In a sea of information, there was very little of it to use. That's the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, right? Where you're dying of thirst surrounded by water because it's all seawater. We are dying of, I don't know what we're dying of, but we're surrounded by information, but it may be of very little use to us, just as the water surrounding the Ancient Mariner may be of very little use to him because he can't drink it. We're surrounded by information. We have, with Google, man, can find out a lot of things very quickly. But I think that we find that, or I find that the best thing in Google is Wikipedia. Because, if you're trying to think of who did the guest voice in that Simpson episode from 1993, you can find it out in Google through Wikipedia pretty quickly. But if you're looking to get a better grasp of, maybe what's going on in terms of the effects of media on culture historically and contemporary, you kind of have to sit down and think and struggle with a book for a while. So I would say, one of the reasons that I pretty much just assigned 3 books for this class is because I'm sending that message that it's not the quantity of information or the variety of it or the ease with which it's retrieved. It's sitting down and thinking and contending with an author. That's the real work of the course. And this is just really Postman kind of saying the same thing that Dewey said about how our information is inert. If somebody tells me that my taxes are going up, which has happened several times, in fact, more times than I can count since I've been living in the city of Philadelphia, that's news I can use, right? Or if somebody tells me that, transgender people will no longer be accepted into the military, that's news that I want to know. Okay, being close to some transgender people. But if somebody tells me that Donald Trump has paid off another person to keep quiet about his sexual life, at a certain point, I don't want to know this about anybody. I don't want to know those things. I guess it's important because he is president of the United States, but really, I don't want to know that kind of stuff. And most of it is just dead stuff, inert stuff. But I don't know. Well, here is the dark side of the global village, right? As he himself says, everything's become everyone's business. This is McLuhan hinting at this earlier in the course when he talks about everyone is maliciously involved in everyone else's business. But Postman is much more open about it being a global village, being kind of, terrible place. For the first time, we were sent information which answered no question we'd asked, and which in any case did not permit the right of reply. There's no dialogue in television. It's just all being thrown at you. Telegraphy also made possible discourse essentially incoherent. See, this is the real point he's making, right? It brought into being a world of broken time and broken attention. The principal strength of the telegraph was its capacity to move information, not collect it, explain it, or analyze it. In this respect, telegraphy was the exact opposite of typography. Here we see what he calls the roots of what he's critiquing in television culture to come, a world of decontextualized information, a world in which the demands of logic, which were right up front with print, are being shunted aside, and a world in which the PeekaBoo World, here's this, that keeps our attention momentarily and then is lost. So there's no time for reflection, there's no time for analysis, there's no time for logical criticism. As he says, the Telegraph demands that we burn its contents, like Instagram, right? As I understand it, that's the whole point of Instagram, is that it burns its contents. But the Telegraph, he said, already did that. That is, it's momentary. The Telegraph throws out this bit of information, but then it immediately demands that you burn it to make way for the new bit of information and the new bit. You can sort of see what he's getting at here. In a way, he's describing the massage, but he's describing it, he's critiquing it. He's saying it has had disastrous effects on our capacity to reason and to engage in serious public discourse. The world as depicted by the Telegraph began to appear unmanageable, even undecipherable. The line-by-line, sequential, continuous form of the printed page slowly began to lose its resonance as a metaphor of how knowledge was to be acquired and how the world was to be understood. Knowing the facts took on a new meaning, for it didn't imply that one understood implications, backgrounds, or connections. So I suppose this is the shift of metaphors that he's talking about, which happens when there's a shift from one dominant medium to another. What does it mean to know something in the television age? He's claiming that it's different. Perhaps he's claiming that in a certain way, the standards have just been drastically deteriorating. That the standards of what it means to know something, which means to have background, to be able to analyze it, to critique it, has given way to the superficial knowledge, which is sort of television knowledge, image dominated, catchphrase dominated. What does it mean to know about Donald Trump? This is just, even students I've had who have been had very strong antipathies towards Trump. If I ask them, what they don't like about him, they'll say he looks like a Cheeto or something, or they'll make fun of his hair, which may be true that he, has these, but is absolutely irrelevant, right? I mean, to dislike somebody because of their looks, they have a silly hair, or they, have used bronzing agent on their skin. That's not a serious reason to dislike Donald Trump, right? You have to have more. But if that's what we're satisfied with now, in terms of, well, I don't like Obama because he's snooty, I don't like Hillary Clinton because I think she doesn't wear the right kind of pantsuits or something, we're in big trouble, right? Is what Postman is saying. I mean, it's okay to not like Obama or Clinton. It's okay to not like Trump. But in the print culture, the immediate thing is, well, why? What is your argument? In the television culture, we just accept that, oh, you don't like him because he looks like a Cheeto, or you don't like her because you don't like the way she looks in a pantsuit, which is, so stupid, frankly. Together, this ensemble of electronic techniques, and now he's sort of jumping ahead to the 20th century television, radio, the things that were built, made the telegraph obsolete. Together, this ensemble of electronic techniques called into being a new world, a PeekaBoo World, where now this event, now that pops into view for a moment, then vanishes again. It is a world without much coherence or sense, a world that does not ask us, indeed, does not permit us to do anything. A world that is, like the child's game of peekaboo, entirely self-contained. But like peekaboo, it is also endlessly entertaining. I don't want to be a snob. I mean, I hope that he's not a snob, but kind of is. But, if you can give your argument for your snobbery, I guess you have to be listened to, right? But I think I know what he means, and we all have different weaknesses for this. For me, it's YouTube. The YouTube video is the great enabler of the person with the short attention span. You can sort of endlessly click on videos in your area of interest that are 3 to 7 minutes long, and none of them very important, and all of them, just waiting for the next one. It's like eating candy or chips, really, with lots of MSG.